Yes, thank you. This is an attempt to address point B in the program, the question of how one will construct a political community with participation. How can participation be enhanced, especially among the marginalized? This is, of course, an extremely tall order. So I have tried, this is a very exploratory paper, unfinished in terms of conclusions, but I will try to suggest to you some sort of parameters for thinking about this issue. And I assume democracy is what we talk about. This is in the program at the UN. One speaks about good governance and democracy as such, which is not a universal institution, although very widespread, is also very controversial in many places. So let's try to philosophize about the relationship between participation and democracy, and about the requirements for better participation. And in a way, the very good news is, of course, that there is nothing top-down about democracy. It is, in fact, a very bottom-up polity type. It is not an aristocracy, oligarchy, or kingly rule. It is the form of government whereby the participants in society, called the citizens, have all power. They are the sovereign. Sovereignty belongs to those who have the vote in such a political system. So it is the maximum sort of bottom-up type of political government. And there's nobody to blame if things go wrong in a democracy other than its citizens. Of course, in reality, there will be lots of politicians who are not very responsive to their vocation, but the theory is very clear. It's a bottom-up political system. And democracy is based on participation through citizenship, which is a privilege and historically has been a very rare privilege, a real privilege, not for everybody. It is a right. Today, if you are born within a state, you have a right to citizenship most of the time, but citizenship is decided by the state, who has the right to become a citizen, and with citizenship comes duties. So this is usually illustrated by the social contract model. And historically, it is, I think, a good idea to dwell a bit on the genesis of this political system, because it is one where one has the development of a system of rule of law much earlier than participation. And it is very late historically that we get the vote for women. The latest group to have the vote is women. Before that, it was a working class. And before that, again, the bourgeois revolutions. And even before that, the aristocracy asking for and demanding and sometimes taking power from an absolute king. So one has a historical evolution and revolution, a power grab of new classes. So as it was remarked here earlier, that this participation doesn't come as a sort of virtue that matures in the human being. It comes as a result of often class struggle, power struggle. And there is a constant debate about the needs, the prerequisites in voters, in participants, which is also very recent historically, in a sense. One has the discussion in John Stuart Mill's on liberty. It's 1859, and he discusses who is independent enough from being employed, from being poor, who has enough independence to be rational in a way, to be independent of others' interests. Can an employed person really, should he or she have the vote, who is educated well enough to vote, who is rational. And he discusses famously that women are rational and therefore should have the vote. So On Liberty is a very crucial book, I think, for understanding these dilemmas that have continued to be debated. So we have, in a way, an old notion from ancient Greek philosophy about what is the best society, what is the best form of government. This is Plato, this is Aristotle. One has citizenship for the very few at this time. The best man, the aristoi, should rule. This is the best kind of rule. Democracy is the worst kind of rule as such. And one has then, much later in history, the universalization of suffrage, of the vote. So participation appears very late in history. Women get the vote in Norway in 1913, for example. So if this is the perspective, there's a long history, but there's a late historical development in terms of participation. If we look at the form of government, namely democracy, it is confined to the state. The state is the power, sort of the power, system of power, recognition and organization. This is the given. So we have in the UN about 193 states, I think, is the current membership based on UN Security Council recognition of states. We have states that are not members. Kosovo is one state because Russia doesn't recognize Kosovo. We have states that we don't recognize in the West, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, which is Russian republics for the time being. We have the Palestinian Authority, almost a state, but not quite. The Holy See is also one of those quasi-states in a way. And we have so many nations or groups that have a common history, culture, perhaps even language. We have many thousands of those groups that would like a state, and we have ongoing conflicts and wars over that. So the Kurds would like one state or 4 states, depending on whom you ask. And many of the current de jure states in the UN are, of course, from the 1960s, post-colonialism, random drawing of borders on the African map, on the Middle East map. So nations and states do not coincide. Then there is also, this is a period of unprecedented spread of democracies from 1990 onwards. We have so many democracies as never before on the globe. However, there's now a counter push against this, and much resistance, Russia, China, for instance, other states that fear democracies. And power is, in a way, changing, the power balance is changing. So we see that the spread of democracy and globalization is by no means effortless and very progressive at the time, for the time being, although we've had 1990 onwards to about 2015 with an unprecedented sort of spread of democracy. And when we look at these, the 2 main obstacles to meaningful participation, corruption and armed conflict, we have, it's a rather sort of sad picture of corruption. I looked at Transparency International's statistics for 2015, where we have, I was going to say, as always, the Nordic countries, they are on top of the list of being non-corrupt, but in Europe we have countries like Spain, number 36, this is a list of 197 entries, Spain number 36, Hungary number 50, Greece 58, Italy 61, fairly far down, fairly much corruption in those states, various types of corruption certainly, but then many African states, Somalia is always at the sort of bottom of all these indexes, number 167. But corruption is so important in terms of participation and democracy, because with corruption there can be no justice in paying taxes, there can be no justice in, there is not meritocracy, and it will be very hard to have any kind of checks and balance and rule of law. And I can't leave out nepotism, or as we call network corruption, today is a major obstacle to any democratic polity, really. And this is, Max Weber has formulated this very well about how one has to have a disinterested civil service and a meritocracy in order to have fairness, justice in a society. So we have a very, in a way, a lot of problematic aspects about the spread of democracy and meaningful participation. Armed conflict, although there are fewer civil wars than before, we have more of a new Cold War type of situation. There are about 40 armed conflicts ongoing, defined as a certain number of battle-related deaths every year. This is Uppsala University and Peace Research Institute of Norway. They have statistics on this, but also International Strategic Studies Institute in London publish sort of the roll call on armed conflict. And clearly, if there is violence in the territory, if there is not the, what we say, the state's monopoly on violence, if police is not able to keep control of the territory of the state, and if there is violence in terms of civil war or spoilers, conflicts, then there can be no democracy. I think one of the good definitions of the democratic way of government is that it is a non-violent conflict resolution method, in a way. So clearly, when we speak about the marginalized of the world, they are much more affected by both corruption and armed conflict in Africa than in Europe, although this varies around the world. Now, participation as a democratic norm. If we establish that there must be some kind of democratic polity or system of government for participation to be meaningful, this is what political participation means. I think it can be useful to think about participation as being in two types of societies. We have the Gesellschaft, the German word for society, which is much more instrumental. It is based on, let's say, the social contract. I have rights and I have duties, and there is rule of law, there is accountability. It is a type of society that it is not a thick, there is no need for a thick identity, for a sort of nationhood feeling of belonging, but it is more transactional. And that in itself is no small achievement, to have a well-ordered democracy that isn't really very, should one say, cohesive. One could even argue that immigration today means that there will be much more of this kind of society. This is the future of democracy, that there will be various kinds of thicker communities, but then a more sort of a political constellation whereby one resolves conflicts and governs. So this is a possible argument. Although I think most of us would like there to be a Gemeinschaft, a community, not only a society, a community of deeper identity, maybe a nation, as we usually associate with nation, to which one has loyalty, which one has, calls a patrie, a home country, which will entail much more solidarity. Not only that I pay my taxes because I need to do so in order to have a functioning welfare state, but that I pay my taxes because I really would like my society to be a good society, solidaristic society. But this is a useful distinction in sociology. And in Catholic social teaching, of course, there is this search for the common good. It's Aristotle onwards to Thomas, St. Thomas, and some would say that the whole of political philosophy is either a sort of in the Aristotelian tradition or more of a utilitarian type of tradition. But at a minimum, democracy must be a social contract, and then one must try to develop more of a community, a common good. And here Catholic social teaching has these terms of subsidiarity and solidarity, and I think they are very useful in analyzing this. We could say that subsidiarity is found empirically in the EU system, in the German state of a federal state. In the US, you have a federal state. Not that they are models of democracy, but the idea is that you should participate in decisions that affect yourself. So this is the closeness principle, as we call it, the right to decide on issues that affect your life. This is also Carol Pateman, a political scientist, who wrote a famous book in 1917 called Participatory Democracy, or it was called maybe it was something, the title, it was about participatory democracy, and the main idea was the closeness principle. You should determine your own fate, in a way, your own life. And this can be seen as an ontological necessity, as an Aristotelian principle. We are born as social beings. We therefore need social contact. Society is an ontological necessity. But it can also be seen as a power principle. I have a right to influence decisions that affect my life. Ergo, the movement towards owning your workplace, owning your company, sort of the cooperative movement, and so on. And this is, of course, a principle of participation that needs a political context where you can be influential in decisions in your local community, in your region, and in your nation, and beyond. And federalism, which Catholic social teaching promoted quite a lot when the EU was young and undeveloped in a way, is such a principle where one postulates there is not only the right to participation, but there is a natural division of issues that belong to the local level, belong to the regional level, belong to the national level. One problem of democracy today in Europe is that the EU has supranationalized, taken power to itself, of course, given by states initially, and the debate is therefore about retaking power to the national level. Brexit is an expression of this, although it is only part of the story. So ideally, participation goes with the city-state, then one could say, the Greek city-state, the Italian city-state, local self-government. However, there is no such thing, in a way, on offer in the world. We are in states. We are in nation-states, in fact. So we could say that the given is a globe with 193 states, more or less. Some small, some empires, all imperfect, not what we would choose. We would choose the sort of city-state concept if we wanted to maximize participation, but we would have to choose a bigger unit if we are to be effective in solving international problems. So there is the dilemma between effective output and participation. And I think, without spending too much time on it, I think it's again instructive to look historically that the state that is given, the sort of unit we have, contains mostly a system of rule of law which has been developed much, much earlier than democratic participation. I can't, as a Norwegian, I can't resist referring to the thing, which is not the things, but the thing. The Storting is the Norwegian parliament, and the Alþingi is the Icelandic parliament, and the Folketing is a Danish parliament, meaning national assembly. And around year 1000, we have still pagan Viking times in Iceland and Norway, but they are quite sophisticated in establishing rule of law. So they establish rule of law through the free men who meet at the thing, at this place, specific place, once a year, usually in June. And they give laws, they vote on new laws, and they are, and judges exist that can read laws and apply them. So they, you know, the typical punishment for manslaughter in year 1000 is to be banned from Norway to Iceland. If you kill your neighbor in Iceland, you're banned onto Greenland. And if you happen to be the son of one of these outlaws in Greenland and your name is Leif Erikson, you end up discovering America, Newfoundland. That's an aside. But the point is that the rule of law is early historically, before democracy is participation for all. And rule of law is necessary with the checks and balance that implies in order for participation to be meaningful. So participation in itself cannot exist. And then the form of government we have today is also old, but not very, very old. After 1648, we have the state. Of course, state means status in the Latin. So it's a well-known concept. But the form of government that is most prevalent in world history is the empire. Empires, not states. But the type we have is the nation state. And one of the protagonists is, of course, this little Frenchman, famous Napoleon, who says, you are all Frenchmen. I mean, you are not Bretons, you are not this or that, you are Frenchmen. And he consolidates the nation for the state. And conscription to die for your nation becomes obligatory as a duty, as does tax paying and loyalty to Paris and so on. And this is, again, a given, because we get this forging of nations after the states have been completed, so to speak, as territorial states. And that means that today participation is in some form of nation state. And the tragedy, of course, is that so many states have no nation. We have states in Africa where the clans, the families, the tribes, they are not at all, as I said, coinciding with the state borders. But the state system remains and must be conservative. One cannot allow for new states. One cannot want new states because they are usually made through revolution, violence, wars. So it means, in a way, the state system, the diplomatic system, the power system of the world is quite conservative and quite primitive in that sense. So when we get then to the present, we have this system of the given. The state border is given. Sovereignty belongs to the state. Citizens are decided by the state who will become a citizen. Nobody has a right to become a citizen in any other state. And I tell my students that, you know, you young women and men, you are obliged to defend this Norwegian state, you know, even die for your state. Are you prepared to do that? It's in the Constitution. Could also be a reality given Russia's aggression for the time being. I say you have no right to, for instance, go to the US. If you have been done some drunk driving in your life, you'll probably never get a visa. And this is a way of, this is sort of a surprise to a young generation used to universal human rights, that they can go anywhere on the globe and enjoy the human rights. But even human rights are only guaranteed, are to be given, to be implemented for you by your state. It's not the UN that guarantees your human rights. It's in legal theory, it is the government of your own states. So in a way, we have a sort of the state system is extremely important when we talk about how to improve participation. And one implication of this is, of course, that a citizen ought to remain in his or her state to build it, because this is bottom-up. Democracy is, per definition, as I said, bottom-up. So migration shouldn't happen if it is for economic reasons. And here the individual logic of instrumental gain, in a way, says, of course you should migrate. You can get to a much better place politically and economically for you and your children. So on the individual logic, everybody who is in a less attractive state, economically, politically, compared to, let's say, the Nordic states, should emigrate. Why not? And of course, I have 4 children. I can see how I would want the best place for them, the best lives for them. But on the political logic of citizenship, of democracy, you should stay and build your own state, build your own democracy, if participation is going to create a good society. So then we get to the sort of concluding policy advice section, which is the weak part of my paper. It will be developed more. And I was very grateful for the statistics we saw earlier from Professor Sachs, because it was about economic growth and improvement and about education, the UN development goals. And we have seen how extreme poverty is being reduced. This is one of the really big pieces of good news in the world. Extreme poverty and also relative poverty. And one could say that extreme poverty is or reducing extreme poverty is an absolute requirement for democracy, for participation. Because money is not an issue, as we say, when you have it. But if you don't have it, it certainly is. So in order to be a citizen, to think of society, to work for society, you need to have your basic needs covered. And in revolution theory, Marx and Engels and so on, you remember this debate about how poor must you be in order to start a revolution. Is it when you're dirt poor, when you're extremely poor? Is that when you create revolution? Or is it when you have a little so that you have the sort of power to do the revolution? And of course, revolution is the sort of the maximum bottom-up political movement to improve society. But we usually don't condone it because it is violent. We want incremental, we want evolution. So if we think about economy, which is not my expertise at all, but if relative and also extreme poverty is being reduced, then there is the possibility of concentrating much more on education, because education, not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also education to be a citizen is a very important, extremely important tool of enhancing participation. And I find that this is also true in Europe. We are very weak in educating for democracy or for citizenship. That has to do with globalization, because the young generation has learned about you have universal human rights, but they haven't learned much about their own sort of society's history, and politics and duty. I mean, the concept duty, which we discussed with Professor Weiler here, is conspicuously absent. So this is a need both for developing countries and the developed countries. And in developing countries, children are much happier to be at school than in European countries, where they would like to rather drop out quite often. But this also has to do with the anthropological issue at present, which we also talked about, this dominant, self-centered, individualistic logic, which is so prevalent in economic science or in the teaching of economics, in how we assume economic actors are. They are maximizing utility agents, and in politics often as well. So this is an area where the church has a lot to offer in education, and I think the sensible citizen. Bottom up, yes. What about the international community, the IOs, international organizations? It is in the program stressed that one does a lot to create institutions for democracy, but democracy must be developed by people themselves. Quite right. This is, of course, obvious. The international community can do more, and here I mean the UN, NATO, EU, other IOs and countries, rich world, through development assistance. I mean, it is peace building, it is the ending of wars, which is essential. It is education, it is conditionality of various kinds. I think we have many examples of having put a lot of effort and money. I worked a lot on Bosnia when I was a politician. It has an elaborate democratic system. It has a lot of investment in a way from development aid. It is no better in a way now than 20 years ago politically. It is without war, yes. There is no war, but it has not matured as a democracy very much. Perhaps only EU membership can improve on that. But my point is that it's extremely difficult to impose. One cannot impose democracy by force, unlike what George Bush was trying to do. One cannot do that, but one can facilitate. Just like peace, one cannot impose peace if the parties don't want to do the main job of peace creation, but one can facilitate. So there should be just a continuation, intensification of current work, but perhaps in a smarter way, with much more emphasis on how to make participants themselves become agents of their own political futures. So in a way, my conclusion is that democracy is not alive, it is not real, unless one takes charge of it oneself. And to teach people how to do that is something that other countries can do and should do more of. Perhaps I will end with a quote, not from the Pope, but a very good quote here from Bishop Marcello Sorando, who says, assume your responsibilities, take the culture of work, study, and solidarity into your own hands to achieve a worthy and free future for your personal and social good. This is from the youth symposium that was here on the sustainability goals. So in a way, a lot is given, much in terms of the political form of democracy. A lot can be done in enhancing participation that isn't just self-centered or self-interested. Thank you.